If you're still awake at this hour, you already know why the silence has such a heavy pull tonight. The air outside the window is heavy, thick with the smell of wet pine and something else, something sharp and electric, like static that hasn't found a place to ground itself. That's the feeling of a world unseeming. Tonight, we're driving back into the deep cuts of the calendar, back to 2003, along a stretch of asphalt known only to the locals, the Blackwood Pass. It's the kind of road that chews up cell service and spits out bad omens. My name, in this version of the story, is Elias Thorne. I was 42 that year, a state trooper, divorced, living on bad coffee and the lingering hope that my daughter, Lena, 16 and furious, would eventually forgive me for walking away from her mother. The night shift was my purgatory. I drove those lonely miles between the skeletal pines of northern New England, the cruiser's radio mostly silent, the only companion the glow of the dash and the endless rush of the void. On the 17th of May, the call came down, clipped and strange. Not a collision, not a breakdown, but an unspecified obstruction on the pass near the old quarry, mile marker 17. The dispatcher's voice had that flat, unconcerned tone that only covers total confusion. I flipped the siren for form's sake, but even the sound felt absorbed by the oppressive gloom of the forest. When I reached the spot, the first thing that hit me was the wrongness of the light. It was past midnight, yet the air shimmered with an unnatural haze, an internal gray glow that didn't come from my headlights or the moon. Then came the rain, not falling down, but rising. Tiny, silvery droplets were launching themselves vertically from the wet asphalt, accelerating upward until they vanished into the tree line. My stomach turned over. This wasn't weather. This was a violation of the fundamental laws we take for granted. I pulled the cruiser to a stop 50 yards away, killed the engine, and stepped out into the bizarre, reversed drizzle. The cold, what air tasted of chlorine and iron. The obstruction was a vehicle. A black, heavily modified sedan, a government-issue car, by the looks of the subtle reinforcing, was stationary, but not truly stopped. It was unmoving. It was facing away from me, towards the western edge of the pass, yet the brake lights were briefly flaring, then dimming, then flaring again, as if the driver were gently reversing the motion of having slammed on the brakes moments before. The scratches on the paint were slowly knitting themselves closed. I approached cautiously. The sensation was immediate and visceral, like walking through pressurized water. The world felt thick, resistant to forward movement. I had a small, poorly healed scrape on my knuckles from changing a tire that afternoon. As I crossed the invisible boundary line, perhaps 3 car lengths from the sedan, I glanced down. The scab was shrinking, lightening in color. A fraction of a second later, it was gone, leaving behind perfectly smooth, unblemished skin. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us, waiting for us to notice the flaw in the facade. But this was different. This wasn't about watching. This was about unwatching. The world was playing the tape backward, and I had just stepped onto the rewinding spool. I radioed in, trying to sound professional while my heart hammered against my ribs. Kowalski, I've got an active scene at 17. Possible, temporal anomaly. Repeat, I need backup, maybe specialized response. Kowalski's voice crackled back, static-laced. Thorne, cut the physics talk. What do you see? I see rain falling toward the sky, Sarge. And I see a car that is slowly uncrashing itself. Inside the sedan, a figure was stirring. I drew my sidearm, the cold weight a minor comfort in the face of impossible physics, and moved toward the driver's door. The glass was heavily tinted, but I saw movement. A girl. She seemed to be fighting something, or perhaps unfighting something. She was visibly shaking, though the air inside the dome of the reversal felt oddly warm. "State police. Step out of the vehicle slowly," I commanded. The door swung inward, not opening, but unshutting itself with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The person who emerged was tiny, trembling, and wearing an MIT lanyard beneath an oversized lab coat. She looked no older than 14, maybe 15. Her hair was dark, cut short, and her eyes were what stopped me cold. They held the exhausted, panicked knowledge of a woman twice her size. She spoke, and the sound was thin, high-pitched, but the vocabulary was dizzying. "Don't touch the substrate. It's accelerating. The collapse of the local coronal knot. It's not linear. We initiated the temporal containment procedure, but the field generator went critical. I was 38 years old, officer. 38. I drove this car here, and now." She looked down at her hands, the skin smooth, unlined, but the joints stiff. "Now I'm a child again. And soon, I won't even be that." This was Dr. Asa Chun. I would learn later, or rather, a rapidly de-aged version of her. She was a quantum physicist, one of the brilliant, reckless minds who had accidentally punched a hole in the universe on this secluded stretch of highway back in 1991 during a classified temporal experiment gone wrong. The inversion material, highly unstable, had been left behind after the initial, smaller explosion and had festered here for over a decade. Dr. Chun had been the first victim caught fully within the field's core, which now extended about 50 feet wide, centered on her vehicle. She had been living backward for perhaps an hour in real time, long enough to lose 24 years of aging. I was standing on the periphery, only experiencing minor, intermittent reversals, the healing of my scrape, the slight, backward pull on my exhaled breath. But Dr. Chun was in the full current, and the horror on her face was not the horror of a teenager. It was the absolute, existential dread of an adult woman watching her life undo itself, memory by memory. She pointed a shrinking finger toward the ground beneath the car. "The anchor point. It's what stabilized the initial accident site. If the field expands exponentially, and it is, the entropy reversal will swallow the whole coastline. Everything unwinds. Cars uncrash, buildings unbuild, people unexist." This concept, the complete undoing of causality, violated every known principle. But that is the terrifying beauty of psychological horror. It forces you to accept the impossible premise and live within its dread. The grounding fact here, the horrifying physics, is that time is simply the measure of increasing entropy. When you reverse entropy, you reverse time. When you see a broken glass piece itself back together, you are witnessing the death of certainty. I took Dr. Chen's arm, pulling her out of the strongest part of the shimmer, toward the boundary line. Her small frame felt disturbingly light. "We need to get you clear, Doctor. How do we stop it?" "The core object," she whispered, her voice tightening, sounding younger still, closer to 12. "It's embedded in the asphalt. A small sphere, the size of a golf ball. The initial test material. Only a high-density, rapidly polarizing containment field can absorb the feedback loop." I saw the exhaustion, the loss of complex thought already beginning to fog her eyes. The trauma was erasing itself, taking her awareness with it. The deeper she regressed, the less she would remember, until eventually, her mind would be blank, unwritten, and then her physical form would dissolve entirely, never having been born. Before I could process the true scale of what she said, the silent forest was interrupted by the urgent, low-pitched whine of approaching vehicles. Not Kowalski and his backup. These were fast, black SUVs with tinted windows and no recognizable markings. The specialized response. And they looked furious. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. This wasn't an accident. This was a cover-up erupting from the ground, a secret trying to swallow reality whole. I shielded the terrified child physicist just as two men in ballistic gear spilled out of the first vehicle. The cavalry had arrived, but they felt less like rescue and more like executioners. My own clock, I realized, was ticking faster now, reversing with every second I remained near the Blackwood Pass aberration. The men who materialized from the black SUVs moved with brutal, efficient silence. Their leader, a pale man in a sharp suit who introduced himself only as Agent Kale, bypassed me completely and focused on the shrinking figure of Dr. Chun. Kale's expression was flat, clinical, confirming my immediate dread. This was not a rescue mission, but a triage of a national security threat. Dr. Chun, status report. The secondary stabilizing anchor, did you deploy it? Kale's voice was low, authoritative, laced with the metallic tang of deep government secrets. Dr. Chun, who now looked closer to 11, stammered, her high voice thin with terror. In inversion feedback, loop. It's exponential, Agent. We've lost the linear metrics. It's unspooling the chronal, not faster than predicted. She stumbled over the scientific terms, her brain already losing the complex vocabulary of adult physics. Kale looked at me, a policeman standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Officer Thorne, you have witnessed a classified event. We require your immediate cooperation and silence. This area is now under federal jurisdiction. You are experiencing minor residual effects, primarily accelerated cellular repair. Stay 50 feet outside the perimeter. I refused to back down. This wasn't a standard incident. It was existential dread materialized on the asphalt I was sworn to protect. She said it's expanding. How fast? And what's the core object she mentioned? The sphere. Kale sighed, a sound of profound annoyance, as if dealing with me was an unexpected variable in a delicate equation. He pulled me aside, away from the immediate shimmer of the reversing rain. Look closer, officer. The field isn't expanding linearly. It's doubling. Every few hours. Right now, it's maybe half a mile across. By morning, it could be 4. By the end of the week, it could be the entire eastern seaboard. This is a local reality inversion driven by a rogue element of Project Kronos. We are working against causality itself. He handed me a small, heavy device, a radiation meter that also tracked energy signatures. The dial was pinned, screaming in the direction of Dr. Chen's vehicle. The sphere is a concentrated temporal singularity generator, what you might call a speculative concept. It doesn't emit radiation, it absorbs existence. It pulls everything back to its initial state, the state of absolute, unwritten non-existence. I looked at the doctor. She was now a frightened little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sitting hunched against the cruiser wheel. She was crying, but the tears seemed to dry instantly, leaping back into her ducts. She didn't recognize Kale, or me, or the fear. She was losing her personal history second by second. The trauma was being erased, but the person was being erased along with it. The emotional arc was hitting me hard. This wasn't just a physics problem. This was the ultimate violation of family. Losing years of memory, watching your daughter ungrow, it was horror in its purest, most psychological form. This is the terrible realization. Our identity is just a cumulative sequence of memories. Remove the sequence, and the self dissolves. I checked my arm again. The initial scrape, gone. But now, I noticed something subtler. My wedding ring finger, long bare since the divorce, felt momentarily lighter. I had a slight scar near my wrist from a reckless childhood bike ride. I focused on it. Under the hazy light of the pass, the scar tissue, a tough, collagenous mass, was softening, thinning. It was beginning to smooth back into the soft, perfect skin of a 10-year-old boy. I was 42, and somewhere inside the reversal zone, the clock on my existence was beginning to run backward. "You've been exposed, Thorne," Cale noted, observing my panic with chilling detachment. "Minimal, but irreversible. You'll rejuvenate rapidly until you leave the area, then slowly. You're perhaps 41 years and 10 months now. You've lost a few weeks." I thought of Lena, my beautiful, complicated 16-year-old who hated me but was still mine. If I continued to reverse, I would lose the memory of her teenage years, then her childhood, then her birth. The love would remain, perhaps, but the context would vanish. This became my driving motivation, stopping this not for the world, but for the memory of my daughter. Cale brought me into his command SUV. It was a mobile laboratory, buzzing with sophisticated sensors and tracking gear. He showed me the projections. The temporal signature was a perfect, rapidly expanding circle centered exactly on mile marker 17. He explained the grounding fact. The speed of the inversion is proportional to the density of recorded temporal events. A heavily trafficked highway, a place where causality is constantly written, acts like a massive magnet for the reversal field, giving it fuel to expand faster. "We need to stop the feedback loop immediately," Cale stressed. "The sphere has to be retrieved. But no one can enter the epicenter and survive the regression." "Why not you?" I asked, my voice tight. "I'm too far from the origin point. We've established a crucial biological parameter. The farther back a person's existence is from the incident date, 1991, the slower their reversal. You, Officer Thorne, were 30 years old when the accident occurred. You have reserves. Dr. Chun was 38. She is almost gone. She's now regressed past 1991. She is fading toward absolute non-existence." I glanced out the window. Dr. Chun, huddled on the ground, now looked no older than 5. She was babbling soundlessly, rubbing her eyes, showing signs of severe disorientation. Her fine motor skills were degrading. Soon, she would unlearn language. Cale continued, detailing the speculative concept. "We have technology, a highly experimental containment vessel, but it needs to be manually triggered at the source. The sphere has to be extracted and encased instantly. But the field at the core is so intense. Anyone who attempts to retrieve it will regress from adult maturity to unborn non-existence in under 20 minutes." He looked directly into my eyes. "You're physically fit, you've had minimal exposure, and crucially, you were born in 1961. You have the longest regression time of anyone currently on site. You are the only one who can retrieve the sphere and survive long enough to actuate the containment vessel." The horror wasn't just physical. It was the psychological burden of informed sacrifice. I had to enter the zone, knowing that every step I took forward in space was a step backward in my personal timeline. I would not just die, I would unlive. I would lose Lena not to death, but to oblivion. A flash of the future hit me. Lena, growing up, trying to remember a father who simply evaporated. I knew then that my sacrifice wouldn't just save the world. It would ensure that at least someone, somewhere, had the chance to remember me, even if the universe itself was forced to forget. The love felt like the only thing that could possibly survive the complete erasure of history. I agreed. Not for Cale, not for the government, but for the memory of my daughter's first smile. Cale strapped the containment device, a heavy, dull gray cylinder, across my chest. It felt cold against my skin, a temporary anchor against the tide of time. "We monitor your biosigns, Thorne. Your mind will begin to go first. You'll lose higher functions, then declarative memory. Your life, all 42 years of it, will unspool. If you hesitate, the world is gone." I stepped out of the SUV and headed back towards the shimmering reversal zone at mile marker 17. The air grew thicker, colder. The rain was now a fierce upward torrent. I took one last, deep breath of the air outside the anomaly. I was 42 years old, Elias Thorne, and I was walking into my own prehistory. The moment I crossed the perimeter of the intense chronal field, the world went quiet, yet the silence was deafening, a pressurized vacuum where causality was breaking down. The air felt like heavy, ancient honey, resisting every movement. The first major wave of regression hit me almost instantly. My perception of the immediate past began to blur. I tried to focus on the mission, retrieve the sphere, trigger the containment vessel. But the memory of Kale's instructions was already fraying at the edges. I could feel the intricate layers of my recent history peeling back like thin sheets of paint. I was walking, but I felt a distinct, internal pull backward, a profound physical ache as my cells began the impossible task of de-aging. I looked down at my hands. The fine wrinkles around the knuckles were smoothing out, the skin taking on an unsettling, almost translucent quality. The stiffness in my knees, a persistent reminder of 42 years, dissolved, replaced by a youthful, reckless flexibility I hadn't felt in decades. I was Elias Thorne, state trooper, but the uniform suddenly felt oversized, hanging loosely on a frame that was visibly, subtly shrinking. The psychological impact was the true terror. The last 18 months of my life, the acrimonious divorce, the lonely apartment, the deep exhaustion of the night shifts, began to vanish. I struggled to hold on to the memory of Lena, her 16-year-old face contorted in anger, her voice laced with adolescent sarcasm. I needed that anger, that recent pain, because it was what anchored me to the present. Fear isn't just about the unknown future. It's about the terrifying loss of the known past. I reached the black sedan, the epicenter. The vehicle was now almost pristine, unaged, the tires showing zero wear. The faint scent of gasoline was dissolving, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of a factory floor. Beneath the oil pan, I could see it, the speculative concept, the temporal singularity generator. It was a smooth, dull black obsidian sphere, pulsing not with light, but with a deep, internal hush, drawing the energy of time into its core. I was maybe 30 feet from the sphere. Kale's voice buzzed in my helmet comms, sounding frantic and distorted, battling the temporal interference. Thorne, your physical age reading is fluctuating wildly. You are regressing at twice the predicted rate. Move. I pushed forward, fighting the inertia of the field. My mind was now slipping past the most recent decade. The memory of my daughter's 16th birthday party, the silence of the phone call where she rejected my invitation. It was fading, becoming vague, irrelevant. I was back in my early 30s. I was younger, stronger, yes, but crucially, I was losing the adult context that made my sacrifice meaningful. The pain of the divorce evaporated, replaced by the dull, lingering anxiety of a man still trapped in a failing marriage. The grounding fact provided a terrifying logic. The temporal inversion field absorbs memories in reverse chronological order, starting with the least crystallized memories. My recent life, dominated by emotional stress and fleeting interactions, was the first to go. I managed to kneel by the sedan. My body was shrinking quickly, the muscles tightening, the bone density increasing. My voice, when I spoke, sounded like a man in his late 20s, lighter, less worn. I see the object. Initiating contact. I had to reach under the car. As I did, my hand entered the core field's strongest concentration. The sensation was agonizing, not pain, but a rapid, visceral unwriting of physical experience. A deep cut from high school football, an old fracture in my radius. They were dissolving, the tissue reforming perfectly. But the cost was steep, a flash flood of memories rushing backward. I was suddenly 25, a young patrolman, fresh out of the academy. I remembered the eager optimism, the reckless confidence. I remembered meeting Michelle, Lena's mother, for the first time. The depth of my love for Lena remained, but the context had shifted. She wasn't 16. She was a giggling toddler, learning to walk. The mission, the sphere, the government agents. It felt distant, a confused, adult responsibility that was quickly losing meaning. A reflective thought, when the present is dissolved, the past becomes meaningless. It is merely a sequence of unhappenings. My fingers found the sphere. It was cold, unnervingly smooth, and it vibrated with a silent, absolute emptiness. It was the physical manifestation of the void. I gripped it, pulling it free from the melted asphalt. Cale's voice was a shriek in my ear. "Thorne, your age is 23. You've lost all senior officer training. Contain it now." The containment vessel on my chest was heavy. I looked at the dark sphere in my hand and tried to remember the complex three-step actuation sequence. The words polarize, isolate, seal were meaningless static. My brain was discarding decades of declarative knowledge. I was losing vocabulary, losing complex spatial awareness. I was 21, a college student, feeling invincible. I remembered Lena as a newborn, a fragile bundle in my arms. The love was pure, absolute, overwhelming, but the connection to the world outside, the urgency of the mission, was evaporating. Why was I here? What was this dark golf ball? I fumbled with the canister. Instinct took over, the muscle memory of the younger, less educated man. I jammed the sphere into the receptacle, hearing a faint, metallic clack. The device demanded a command sequence, a final button press. My mind, now stripped down to basic survival and primal instinct, could not recall which button. Suddenly, a voice, young and desperate, cut through the static. Dr. Chun. She was now a toddler, babbling incoherently 50 yards away. But amidst the nonsense, one perfect, clear sound. The blue one, Elias. The sound of my first name, spoken clearly by the child physicist who had now unlearned everything she knew, cut through the fog of regression. My mind, regressed to early adulthood, recognized the phonetic instruction but not the meaning. I looked at the console. There was a red button and a small, faded blue button. I was a young man driven by instinct. I focused on the concept of saving Lena, the feeling of absolute fatherly protection, and slammed my hand onto the blue button. The containment vessel didn't just activate, it imploded inward, absorbing the temporal field in a silent, massive collapse of energy. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The shimmering gray light vanished. The reversed rain stopped, instantly replaced by the normal, downward pull of gravity. The silence broke, and the rush of the restored present reality came flooding back. The sound of wind in the pines, the crunch of gravel under the SUVs. I stood there, 17 years old, physically a boy, wearing a man's uniform that drowned me. The containment vessel was inert, cold. I had done it. But the cost. I looked at my hands, small, unscarred. My mind was pristine, unwritten. I remembered my name was Elias, and I remembered a deep, visceral, burning love for a girl named Lena. But I didn't remember who she was, or why I loved her, or that I had ever been her father. All the years of context, the scaffolding of existence, were gone. I turned to see Cale rushing toward me, his face tight with grim triumph. "It's contained. Thorne, you did it." The expansion stopped. But as Cale reached me, His expression faltered. The sphere, contained, had absorbed the massive feedback loop, but it had to dissipate that energy somewhere. And I was the anchor point, the last thing touching it. I felt the final, terrifying inversion. The boy I had become was not de-aging. He was dissolving, not physically regressing, but being unwritten from existence itself. My form flickered. Cale reached out, but his hand passed through my shoulder. My last thought, the purest kernel of being, was only the name, Lena. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, Elias Thorne, all 42 years of him and the 17 years he had briefly become, was gone. Unborn. Never existed. The world he saved instantly forgot him. The silence that followed the silent erasure was not peaceful. It was the chilling sound of a paradox resolving itself, of history correcting an impossibility. When Elias Thorne vanished, the universe complied instantly. He was expunged, scrubbed from the ledgers of causality. In the moment of collapse, the vast chronal energy had not just reversed Elias's personal timeline. It had absorbed him entirely, wiping his existence from the records, official, digital, and cognitive. For the millions he saved, the threat had simply never been. The Blackwood Pass Incident became a closed, classified file concerning a minor geological disturbance and a recovered piece of experimental hardware. I shift perspective now, jumping forward 18 years into the life of Lena Thorne, the daughter of the man who never was. Lena was 16 when the event occurred. In the instant her father was unmade, the memory of Elias Thorne was stripped from her mind. But the universe is a sloppy archivist, and the human heart retains echoes the brain cannot process. The day after the incident, Lena woke up with a profound, aching sense of loss, a vacuum where a figure should have stood. Her mother, Michelle, felt it too, a nagging sense of phantom limb, the vague, sorrowful feeling of a life lived slightly less fully. They lived in an apartment that felt too large, surrounded by photos where one figure should have been present but was always missing, an empty chair at the dining table, a silence in the garage where a familiar voice should have cursed the morning traffic. Lena found herself drawn to the police academy after high school, driven by a nameless, compelling need for order, for resolution. She became a detective, specializing in cold cases and anomalies, the things the world chose to discard or forget. The true horror of oblivion is not death, but the complete lack of a footprint. Lena was a smart, persistent woman in her mid-30s when she finally stumbled across the whispers. She was investigating a local environmental cleanup near the old quarry on the Blackwood Pass, a grounding fact about the area's history, disguised as soil remediation, when she found the first clue, a heavily redacted report labeled Kronos, Project Delta. The file referred to a high-level incident in May 2003 involving a temporal displacement field. The name Blackwood Pass resonated in her core, a familiar, unsettling echo. She began pulling on the thread, obsessively piecing together fragments of a history that, according to everyone around her, did not exist. The specific, speculative concept that drove her was the idea of residual chronal traces, the subtle energetic footprints left behind by massive temporal events. She searched not for evidence of Elias Thorne, the man, but for the energetic signature of his erasure. Her first major lead was tracking down Dr. Asa Chun. Cale's team had placed the doctor in a highly secured facility, where she had stopped regressing at the physical age of 5. Her mental and emotional state was permanently set at that developmental stage, having lost all adult memory, but her body had stabilized, somehow anchoring itself just before the ultimate erasure point of her birth. Lena used her badge to gain access. She found Dr. Chun, a small, bright-eyed woman trapped in the body of a child, spending her days stacking blocks and humming nursery rhymes. The interaction was heartbreaking, but crucial. "Hello, sweetie," Lena said, showing Dr. Chin a picture of the Blackwood Pass location. "Do you remember this place?" Dr. Chin didn't look at the photo. She looked at Lena's face, her brow furrowed with confusion, then smiled, pointing at Lena's uniform insignia. "Blue," she chirped. "Blue. Like the button man. The blue button." The faint trace of the last coherent thought that had saved the world. Lena filed the information away, a single, non-sequitur piece in a puzzle she couldn't yet see. Next, she tracked down Agent Kale, now retired and living in self-imposed isolation. He was guarded, bitter, and deeply paranoid, but Lena's persistence wore him down. She cornered him in a desolate diner, showing him the classified Chronos file she had acquired. Kale was shocked that she had found the file, but still refused to confirm the existence of Elias Thorne. "The official narrative is complete, Detective," Kale stated, sipping black coffee. "There was no officer. We handled the containment ourselves. The records prove it." "But the gap in the records proves the opposite," Lena countered, leaning across the table. "You had a massive temporal event. Someone had to go into that core, someone who fit the profile. Born 1961, 30 years old at the initial phase of the experiment. That profile fits a missing person, Agent Kale, even if that missing person was erased." Kale finally looked at her, a flicker of genuine regret crossing his face. "The field absorbed him, Detective. Not just his body, but his causality. He was never unborn. He just never existed. It's a clean sweep. If I acknowledge his existence now, I risk a secondary temporal feedback loop. It's the ultimate ethical dilemma, one man's oblivion versus global reality." Lena understood the horror of his situation, but she pressed on the emotional arc. "But if he saved the world, Agent, there must be a trace, a residue of that sacrifice." Kale reluctantly offered one speculative concept that kept him awake at night. "We believe, due to the rapid neurological regression, that the victim's core identity, his deepest emotional anchor, was Lena. His last memory, that kind of pure love and absolute intention focused on one person, sometimes leaves a faint, resonant impression on the physical location of the erasure. An echo." He cautioned her. "Do not go back there, Detective. Whatever trace exists, it is not your father. It is a projected remnant of a broken existence." Lena took the warning as confirmation. She had spent years trying to fill the void, driven by a deep, unnamed need to reconcile with the absent father she couldn't remember arguing with. Now she knew. The void was real, and it had a name. The climax was drawing near. Lena had discovered a journal in her attic, a worn leather-bound notebook full of observations about the stars, the weather, and personal reflections on fatherhood, written in a handwriting that was utterly unfamiliar, yet evoked a profound sense of comfort. It was Elias's journal, one of the artifacts that had somehow resisted the ontological erasure because it was physical, separate from his official record. It was the only concrete link she had to the man who saved her life by losing his own. She realized the final act had to take place where the erasure occurred. On the 19th anniversary of the Blackwood Pass Incident, Lena packed her car. She was going back to mile marker 17, to stand in the place where her father had unexisted, hoping to find the love that even the void couldn't swallow. The drive back to the Blackwood Pass felt less like a journey and more like a pilgrimage into a haunted past. The evening was cold, the air thick with the promise of early spring rain. It was May 17th, the anniversary. 19 years ago tonight, the man the universe forgot had vanished on this desolate stretch of road. Lena parked her unmarked detective car exactly 50 yards from mile marker 17, the spot where Cale had told her the perimeter of the field had stabilized. The physical surroundings were utterly mundane: scrub brush, dense pines, and black asphalt patched with fresh sealant. There was no shimmering light, no reversed rain, just the overwhelming, oppressive silence of the void. She sat for an hour, the engine off, the windows cracked, listening. The silence was absolute, heavier than any silence she had ever experienced in the city. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the causality thread to break once more. She pulled out the journal, Elias's notebook. The grounding fact she clung to was simple. Physical objects, if sufficiently separated from the erased individual's personal records, can retain an imprint of their existence. This journal, filled with unfamiliar handwriting detailing mundane anxieties about budgeting and beautiful, poetic observations about his young daughter Lena, was the last tangible anchor. She started reading a passage written 20 years prior, describing an evening walk with toddler Lena. Tonight, she tried to catch the moon in her hands. That raw, unstoppable wonder. It's the only thing that makes the long hours worthwhile. I hope she never loses that fire, even when she eventually hates me for all the mistakes I haven't made yet. As she read the last line, a profound sorrow, not her own, rose up inside her chest. The emotional arc she had followed for years, the search for a ghost, the validation of a loss, was coalescing into an unbearable weight of grief. Suddenly, a shift. Subtle at first, a creeping dread. The air pressure dropped drastically, and the metallic ozone smell of high energy returned, thin and sharp. She looked up. High above the tree line, the clouds were beginning to shear, twisting against each other in slow, unnatural spirals. The residual chronal trace Cale had warned her about was activating. The purity of the intention, Elias's absolute love for his daughter, was drawing the last scattered, resonant pieces of his unexistence back to the source point. She got out of the car, gripping the journal. She walked toward the mile marker, crossing the invisible boundary into the core zone where the erasure had occurred. The field wasn't reversing entropy tonight. It was manifesting memory. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, like walking on thin ice over an infinite depth. Then she saw it. A faint, flickering distortion in the air, right where the old black sedan would have sat. It wasn't a spectral presence in the classical sense, but an optical artifact, a man-shaped shimmer, like the heat haze rising from hot asphalt, but cold and gray. It possessed no physical form, only light refracted through nothingness. It was Elias. He was wearing the old, slightly too large state trooper uniform she had seen in the blurry, redacted photographs she'd unearthed. His physical age was indeterminate, constantly cycling between the 42-year-old man who started the mission and the 17-year-old boy who disappeared. He was pure echo, a ripple in the fabric of reality. He was looking around, confused, his phantom eyes searching the dark pines. Elias, Lena whispered, the name feeling clumsy and foreign on her tongue, yet deeply right. The figure turned toward her, slowly. His face was indistinct, constantly shifting, but the expression was one of overwhelming, confused sorrow. He spoke, and his voice was a dry whisper that seemed to come from the deepest corner of the woods, vibrating directly in her inner ear. Where did the rain go? Did I seal the box? The blue one. He was stuck in the last loops of his existence, the fragment of memory from his 17th year. He didn't know who she was. The rain stopped, Lena said, her voice shaking but firm. You sealed the box. You saved everyone. The speculative concept of the echo became clearer. This wasn't a ghost. It was a temporal projection, a recording of the final moments of a destroyed consciousness. He could only respond to inputs that existed in those final, regressed minutes. "Lena," he whispered, tilting his shimmering head. Lena stepped closer, holding up the worn leather journal. "I'm Lena. I'm your daughter. I grew up." He stared at the journal, an item that, to him, was still in the future. He couldn't process the concept. He was a teenager with the instinctual, primal love for his child, but no memory of her maturity. "I need to go home." The echo sighed, the sound laced with absolute exhaustion. "I need to tell her I didn't mean to go." Lena realized she couldn't reach the man who saved the world. She could only reach the fragmented young man who loved her instinctively. She had to give him the closure he was robbed of. She opened the journal to a page where he had sketched a simple, almost cartoonish drawing of a little girl catching a kite. Lena, at 6 years old. "You wrote this," Lena said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You loved her. You went in there, and you did what you did because of this love. It was stronger than the reversal." The figure of Elias Thorne stabilized slightly. His face sharpened, briefly resolving into the kind, worn features of the man she saw in the archived photographs. 42 years old, for one fleeting moment. He looked at the drawing, at the love he had meticulously recorded. A wave of profound, adult realization washed over the shimmering form. He remembered the sacrifice, the why. He lifted his hand, a hand made of pure absence, and reached toward her face. He couldn't touch her, but Lena leaned into the cold, electrical charge of his presence. "My fire," Elias whispered, the voice returning to the deep, resonant tone of a tired man. "You kept the fire." He had achieved the full emotional arc, reconciliation and forgiveness, bridging the erasure through pure, unconditional love. The moment was agonizingly beautiful, but fleeting. The trace could not hold. It was a resonance, not a reality. "I remember," he said, the whisper dissolving into the night air. Tell her I never left." The figure flickered violently, cycling through ages, from a worn man back to a frightened boy, then a soundless infant, and then, with a sharp, electric pop, the shimmer vanished completely. The air pressure returned to normal. The trees stopped swaying unnaturally. Lena stood in the profound, restored silence of the Blackwood Pass, the leather journal clutched against her chest. She was alone, but the void was gone. She had found her father, not in memory, but in the truth of his sacrifice. Lena stood on the asphalt of mile marker 17, bathed in the sudden, ordinary moonlight. The air had cleared, the bizarre metallic scent replaced by the familiar damp earth and pine needles. The residual chronal trace was gone, but the echo, the memory of her reunion, vibrated in her bones. She wasn't standing alone. She was standing on ground consecrated by a silent, absolute act of love. She looked down at the spot where the spectral figure of Elias Thorne had stabilized. She ran her hand over the cold, rough asphalt, seeking any trace of the temporal anomaly. She found nothing, no scorch mark, no residual energy, nothing that would ever pass muster in a court of law or a scientific journal. The only remaining evidence was the emotional arc etched into her own soul. Her father had sacrificed everything to ensure the world, and specifically, her world, could continue. He had paid for global causality with his own existence. The next few weeks were dedicated to tying up the loose threads, not of the case, which was officially still dormant, but of her own internal history. She had achieved closure, but the detective in her still needed to organize the facts, the strange blend of folklore and high-level physics that had defined her father's oblivion. She visited Agent Kale one last time, meeting him in a neutral, public space. Cale looked older, less haunted, perhaps sensing that the temporal threat had finally dissipated along with the echo. Lena didn't share the details of the reunion, only the final, crucial grounding fact she had gleaned from the experience. The ultimate collapse of a temporal field doesn't destroy the energy. It converts it into pure informational persistence. Elias Thorne's identity was now information, woven into the fabric of the people he loved, resistant to chronological reversal. I found his trace, Agent, Lena confirmed quietly, and I understood the decision. The complete and utter erasure of one man for the salvation of billions. It was necessary. Cale studied her, relieved by her acceptance. He was a hero detective, a silent one, the best kind. No one will ever erect a statue for him, and that was the price. The universe had to forget him for us to remember anything else. But the memories remain, Lena countered, touching the leather journal she always carried now. Not the kind that can be proved, but the kind that shape existence. She left Cale to his lonely retirement. Her next stop was the highly secure facility housing Dr. Asa Chun. Dr. Chun was still physically 5 years old, still playful, and trapped in a state of pre-language cognitive grace. She was coloring with bright crayons when Lena walked into the room. Lena sat across the small plastic table from the brilliant scientist trapped in infancy. "Hello, Doctor." Dr. Chun looked up, her bright, innocent eyes focusing not on Lena the detective, but on Lena the familiar echo of the man who had briefly protected her in the reversal field. "Daddy," Dr. Chun whispered, picking up a blue crayon and holding it out. Lena's heart fractured and then sealed itself whole again. She was not a 5-year-old's father, but she was the physical manifestation of the love that had defined his final moments. She took the blue crayon. "No, sweetie," Lena murmured, "but I'm his daughter, and he wanted you to know that the blue button worked." Dr. Chun giggled, returned to her coloring, content with the impossible affirmation. It was a bizarre, heartbreaking exchange, the complete reconciliation of the two people Elias Thorne had saved, one by preserving her life, the other by preserving her reality. Lena realized the full, psychological horror of the sacrifice was the loss of context. Elias had lost his life's narrative, but his love had found a way to bridge that gap, residing in the only two people who could ever truly know his truth. The final piece of closure came with her mother, Michelle. Lena sat her mother down and, using the journal and the cryptic facts gathered from Cale and Chun, presented a narrative, stripped of its sci-fi elements but rich in emotional truth. Her father, Elias, had died saving them, performing a noble, forgotten act. Michelle listened, tears welling up not for the man she remembered, but for the profound, deep ache of the man she had forgotten. The constant, subtle feeling of emptiness was finally given a shape, the phantom limb of a marriage dissolved by ontological annihilation. "I always felt like there was a door I couldn't find," Michelle confessed, wiping her eyes. "A dream I couldn't quite remember." "He was real, Mom," Lena confirmed. "And he loved us. And that love survived the thing that tried to unmake him." Lena's obsession didn't vanish, but it softened into quiet conviction. She stopped chasing classified files and phantom energies. She continued her work as a detective, but now she carried an internal shield, a reflective thought that became her motto. Even when reality fails, the emotional truth holds. Love is the strongest anchor against the chaos of the void. She visited the Blackwood Pass one last time as the sun was finally rising, a glorious, painful slash of orange through the pines. She stood exactly where the echo had dissolved, feeling the restored, forward flow of time. Elias Thorne was erased, But Lena was his living memorial, the proof that silent sacrifice can sometimes echo louder than any shout. The past was undone, but the future was secure. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, terrible awe at the fragile tenacity of existence and the powerful, persistent logic of the human heart. The first light of dawn always feels like a lie after a long night spent staring into the abyss. It arrives soft and pale, chasing the heavy shadows back into the corners, promising a return to the linear, mundane world we rely on. But after a journey like tonight's, you know better. You know that reality is less a solid foundation and more a rapidly stitched-up wound, and sometimes the stitches pull free. Elias Thorne is gone, unborn, forgotten, scrubbed from the history he